Helima, you wrote a very prescient note yesterday talking about the importance of Iraq in the region and especially in this tug of war between Iran and the United States. Give me your reaction, first of all, to the news.
I think it's hard to overstate how momentous yesterday's action was. I mean, you had a previous guest on talking about the fact that he was essentially like a vice president of Iran. That would be the equivalent of this type of action. I mean, I think what we're going to be looking at is probably a very, very, ferocious Iranian response in terms of their proxy groups in the region. I don't think this is in any way going to be a short-term issue we're dealing with in the market or in terms of the security situation. Wherever Iran has proxy groups, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, raises a real risk to U.S. corporations, to U.S. citizens in those places. So I think this is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with, potentially through the course of 2020.
The defense secretary has said the game has changed. For you, looking at the oil industry, what does that mean? How has the game changed now for oil?
I mean, I certainly think for U.S. companies operating in Iraq, they are probably pulling out all their American employees right now. I mean, we've already had over the summer several rockets land very close to ExxonMobil facilities. We've had reports that Iranian-backed groups have asked that U.S. companies leave southern Iraq. And so I do think from the standpoint of the U.S. corporate energy industry in the Middle East, I think it is very exposed. The secondary question is, will Iran try to do what they've been doing since May, target major Middle East energy installations? I mean, we had half of Saudi's oil output taken offline temporarily in September. I mean, I don't think any of us should underestimate Iran's capacity to respond to what happened yesterday.
We're looking at WTI and Brent, but I also want to point out that gasoline futures are up more than 4% as well. In recent times, there's been this delicate balance where the producers are getting enough to make a profit, but gasoline has remained very affordable for consumers. Do you anticipate that's likely to change?
I mean, I think what we really need to see is, what is the path for oil? I mean, one of the things that we talked about this summer was oil has become sort of a lagging indicator of Middle East unrest. Oil reacts after something happens. Previously, 5 years ago, we would have talked about oil being over 100 with an incident like this. I mean, the U.S. energy story has in some ways shielded us from the implications price-wise of Middle East unrest. So we really do have to see where we're headed in terms of oil prices, in terms of how this will affect, U.S. motorists.
What about the fact that Saudi Arabia lost a lot of capacity with that attack, and then OPEC and Russia have cut their production output? Do we have enough supply if there are these increased tensions in the Middle East?
I mean, one of the things that the Saudis were very quick to do was to show that they could bring back production. Spare capacity resides largely in Saudi Arabia. And so if we did get major supply disruptions along the lines of what we saw in September, there would be a real emphasis on how quickly can Saudi Arabia ramp up. Now, there are strategic stockpiles that all Western governments have. The U.S. has a strategic petroleum reserve that can be released in the case of a supply disruption. But that's what we will be talking about. That's what planners are obviously dealing with today, is thinking about in Washington, what are the contingency plans if we were to get major attacks on oil infrastructure in the Middle East and disruptions to shipping traffic?
I'm sure that you have some insight into the contingency plans that oil companies have for dealing with this kind of escalation of tension or the potential. Is this likely to be long-term plans coming into play, like beyond January and looking more at all of 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, again, we should not think of it as a short-term, situation. I mean, Qasem Soleimani was head of, the most powerful external security branch in Iran. He directed worldwide operations for the IRGC. He was almost a mythical figure in that country. The response, I think, is going to be something that we will be dealing with over the course of 2020.
Iran, of course, has been under sanctions, but Iraq, we're told, is exporting somewhere or producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. Lebanon. Can you talk to me about some of these other regional players who may get drawn into this?
I mean, Iraq is certainly, and that's why we wrote the note yesterday. We've said, consistently that Iraq could be the tripwire for a head-to-head confrontation between the U.S. and Iran. In terms of Iraq's oil industry, second largest producer in OPEC, they are approaching 5 million barrels of production. The Iraqi oil story has been one of the big success stories recently. And so again, like when we think about exposed energy infrastructure where U.S. companies operate, they operate in Iraq. And so I do think that that is where we're looking at a direct threat to U.S. energy assets,
Helima,
or global assets.